You're having panic attacks, that's all. A panic attack is caused by a need to release stress, but not physically doing it. You've heard of fight or flight. Your body produces adrenaline to prepare for one of the two.
I was sitting in the vat of the chemical dream, a responsive participant in what he believes is a self-fulfilled diatribe aimed just like a gun at the heart of a problem that he's not even begun to feel or respond to or understand. A physician's example of a modern stressed man.
Slide into collective, slide into the cone, a funneling fading image of home. Cry to the scream, the feminine he, into the it, swim the pineal sea. By the thought of dinner-stained dogs, potential constriction and a lack of control. I'm lying in the sphere of a concentric onion, a rising attack for a firmity stall. In the finery of a roving eye-catcher, there's a seed of a spiral, a seed of a fall. A grab at the slide surrounding it all, down into nothing but nothing they call is everything growing surrounding it all. It's all and it's mighty and it's out of control and it's tying me into the source of it all. And it's tying me into the source of it all.
The wanderer looked ahead of him down the winding lane and noticed a gathering in the far distance. He could just make out the different colours of people's clothes that burst through the copse of trees that lay gently outlined on the hill against the early morning sky. What on earth are they doing at this time of the day? He thought to himself. Anybody in their right mind is still lying in bed thinking about turning over and going back to sleep. He set his stick hard against the ground and pushed off in the direction of the happening, deciding that his intended destination could wait a while. As he drew closer to the scene, he started to make out what appeared to be a crowd of people, all with their backs to him, apparently looking at something with great interest. The throng was 3 or 4 thick, and was very unusual in the way that there appeared to be no or very little movement at all. In any other crowd the wanderer had seen, there had been a certain degree of confusion. However, on this occasion, the people were almost stationary, as if what they were staring at had grabbed their attention to such an extent that the thought of moving didn't even enter their minds. He carefully made his way around the outside of the circle, searching for a space to look through. The people he walked behind paid him no heed at all. They just continued to gaze inwards, so attentively, the only thing that enabled him to see they weren't mannequins or statues of some sort were their small patches of breath momentarily caught on the sharp morning air. From where he was now standing, he noticed he'd been mistaken by his initial estimate of the depth of the crowd. As he attempted to see what they were looking at, he managed to count the circle being at least 7 or 8 people's heads thick. He also started to become aware of another aspect of the crowd that was very curious: the composition. Farmers' smocks, top hats, riding boots, cloth caps, frocks, walking boots, working boots, tailcoats, babies' bonnets, braces, long hair, short hair, no hair, walking sticks. In fact, the gathering was made up of literally every part of rural society you could think of. The wanderer was confused. He'd only ever really seen everyone in this close proximity before at church, and even then the lower classes were expected to show deference to the gentry. Here, some people from the upper classes were actually standing behind the working people, and they didn't seem to mind. He carried on around the outside of the circle, still trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening, when suddenly the trance-like state of the people was broken. The crowd started to break up and move away back down the hill towards the road.
Well, that was an excellent one. It seems so obvious now.
What do you think they meant about seeing your car?
So well today, wasn't it?
The conversations trailed away as the people moved off into the distance, until all that could be heard was the odd shout of goodbye and an occasional peal of laughter. The wanderer turned and walked slowly towards where the crowd had gathered, determined to discover what had held their interest in such a most peculiar way. The grass where the people had been standing so still was flattened into an almost perfect circle, and in the centre of this circle was a letdown, or else that's how the wanderer saw it, a wooden cover. After all that, just a wooden cover. On the ground in front of him was what appeared to be a manhole cover made of moss-slime wood going rotten round the edges. It lay contained by a rectangle of plain stone and appeared to be held in place by just 2 rusty hinges. He bent down and tried to lift it. Oh, there must be something else here, he thought to himself. The cover would not shift an inch. He tried again.
It won't move, not unless they want it to.
The wanderer stood up immediately and looked round. The first thing he saw was a smiling face. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in heavy gingham jacket buttoned up to the neck to combat the early morning chill. On his head he proudly wore a red hat pulled tightly down round his ears.
I'm sorry, I was just trying to find out what that was all about.
The stranger stepped forward, chuckling to himself, and shook the wanderer by the hand.
Look, I can tell you're not from round these parts. Why don't you come back to the old smithy and have some breakfast with us? It's only a few minutes' walk away and there's plenty on the go. You can have a bite to eat, a rest, and I'll tell you the story behind what you saw this morning.
The wanderer hesitated.
I'll take it as an insult if you refused.
There was something about the blacksmith that he immediately liked. It wasn't just his generosity. It was something about his whole bearing. He was one of those people you just couldn't refuse. The twinkle in his eyes, his openness, his gait, it all just seemed to fit together. And he thought to himself, I am starving. The 2 men were soon chatting away as if they'd always been the best of friends, and before the wanderer knew it, he found himself walking up the pathway towards a small stone cottage nestled between a boisterously running brook and a huge overhanging willow. The walls were covered in ivy intertwined with a beautifully fragrant honeysuckle which dashed the greenery every so often with a delicate red flower. As the wanderer looked admiringly up at the blanket of thatch that ran as a roof for the cottage, he noticed a trail of smoke that hung delicately onto the chimney, bringing with it the smell of freshly cooking bacon and bread. It was a scene that made his heart sing.
Yeah, the smithy's round the back. The village is only 2 minutes' walk up the road, and you'll be surprised at the amount of business I pick up shoeing strangers' arses. There seems to be an endless stream of them these days, especially on the upper end days.
The wanderer looked at his new friend blankly.
Come on then, let's go inside and I'll tell you all about it.
Inside the cottage, the blacksmith's wife was busy preparing breakfast. As soon as the two men came in through the door, she stopped what she was doing and came over and gave the blacksmith a big hug.
What did they say, love? Did they choose you? Did you ask them about the baby?
Hang on. There's plenty of time for that later. Look, I'd like you to meet a new friend. We met up on the hill. He's come down for some breakfast.
During the introductions, the wanderer noticed how pretty she was. She had beautiful feline eyes, shining blonde hair tied into a bouncy ponytail, the reddest, fullest lips he thought he'd ever seen, and her natal skin was glowing. It was translucent, alive, moving with her smiles and shining through the sun's fingers that were now reaching through the cottage window and dancing in speckled patterns on the bumpy stone floor. She noticed him looking at her bump pushing through her loosely fitting floral dress.
Our first.
When's it due?
We've done the needle test. It's a little boy coming in about 6 weeks.
The wanderer smiled. In such a short time he felt a kinship with her as well, and wished her all the best. He felt a glow of warmth inside. She seemed like the perfect partner for the blacksmith, open, strong, and delicate at the same time, receptive to his male force, but not submissive, holding it, nurturing it, and helping it be what it was. His power lay cradled in her germinating softness, her within him within her. Together they just seemed to complete. The two men sat around the table by the window as she brought over a pan of sizzling bacon and put it next to a basket full of chunky homemade bread, still warm and crisp from the morning baking. Eggs were served, still in their shells, plucked from the bowl of boiling water that hung over the crackling log fire. The table was completed by a huge pot of strong coffee slowly letting out its breath, filling the air with a most delicious rough aroma.
Now, you wanted to know about the operettes.
He looked the wanderer straight in his eye and started to tell him a most peculiar tale. As the two men were walking off down the hill to their breakfast, the upperheads were scuttling away down their tunnel back to the warmth of their small chamber, desperate for a recharge. They'd had a large amount of questions this morning, and although you'd never have spotted it up on the surface, they both felt absolutely washed out.
Come on! Why do you always take so long?
Sent Big Upperhead.
What's the rush? You're always telling them up there to slow down.
Sent back Small Upperhead.
Just 'cause you gotta get those big flopping things banging away on the floor. Flip-flop, flip-flop, flip-flop. Why? I'm sure it's just 'cause you love the sound of their own feet. That's ridiculous. Oh, for pity's sake, don't start all that again.
The two figures carried on moving down the tunnel. The larger one in front, every so often banging into a wall or stumbling over a bump on the floor, and the smaller one hanging behind, just keeping up, sending complaints every few strides. After what seemed like hours to Big Upperhead, he turned the final bend and lurched into the chamber, taking half of the doorway with him. He hurried over to his position, lay down and closed his eyes.
No chance! Oh no, you don't. You did it by yourself last month and know what happened. Can't you just wait? Anyway, there's prizes and that. Before we do anything, I want to get everything back to where it should be.
Big Upperhead sent a resigned sigh to nobody in particular.
It isn't too bad,
he thought to himself. Just at that moment, Small Upperhead appeared in the doorway of the chamber, not looking very happy.
Come on, the quicker we start, the quicker we can get in possession. Don't you look at me like that. It's not my fault you can't move a couple of inches without destroying everything around you.
Big Upperhead sent a tut to himself and started moving things back to where they should be. As he picked up a book, he hadn't realised he was standing on one of the pages.
Oh, wonderful. Don't worry, it's only one of mine. Who cares? That nice farmer gave it me. How to grow your own mushrooms. Why should I bother to do that? You'll only end up sitting on them or something. Why don't you stand all over your own books? I really don't know why you're trying to keep anything nice around here. Why don't you look where you're going, you clumsy?
In mid-trade, Small Upperhead stopped what she was sending. She had looked across at Big Upperhead and noticed that his face had broken into a huge grin. She put the broken saucer she was holding down on a shelf, stared straight back at Big Upperhead, and started to chuckle. quietly to herself initially, but then gradually out into the chamber until the chuckles had turned into strangulated yelps of glee, punctuated by moments of silence every 4 or 5 seconds. These silences were joined by Small Upper Ed, bent double on the ground, desperately trying to get her breath back and to control a helplessly twitching body. Big Upper Ed, forgetting his tiredness, ran across and picked her up and swung her around, dancing and leaping through the air. By this time his laughing had joined with hers into a huge chorus of squawks, staccato yelps and thick guttural sounds that echoed around the chamber, making each of them roar with delight even more. Their two bodies now, almost appearing to be welded together, flew wildly through the room, banging into furniture, spinning against the walls and crashing into pots and pans, all the while squealing until you couldn't tell which sounds came from where. Suddenly it all came to a halt, and the two of them fell to the floor as if something had taken all the bones out of their bodies. They lay there wrapped around each other, their chests rising and falling, staring into each other's eyes, their smiling faces content and together. They were deeply, deeply in love. They both felt it was the right time, so they got into position. It was Small Upper Ed's turn to say when, so she sent the command and together they started. Synchronised, they individually climbed into the upper layer of each of their heads, Small Upper Ed into hers and Big Upper Ed into his. They climbed the ladders, simultaneously entered each of their own pineal glands, and it was inside here where they met with the it and gained the wisdom they'd become so famous for throughout the terrestrial world.
on a Friday at 5:30 in the morning, most of the village go up onto the hill, hoping they're going to be the ones chosen to have their questions answered.
How do the upperheads choose who they're going to speak to then?
I don't know that. All I do know is that the people who have been chosen speak of being almost sent for in their thoughts. They feel a sort of gentle pull, and then know the upheads want them to join them for questions.
Have the upperheads ever not known an answer to a question?
I can't remember that happening. Hang on, there was one occasion. The beta asked why we cry. They didn't answer for ages, and then the most odd thing happened.
What?
They started crying, both at the same time. Then they stopped and started laughing. Very strange.
The Wanderer giggled to himself.
What's the matter?
Well, maybe that was the answer. Perhaps they were telling the baker to think about the fact that laughing comes from the same place as crying, and that he needs to look inside himself to find it.
What? You sound just like them. They're always saying that stuff about looking inside yourself and not expecting the answer to be given just like a present.
The Wanderer smiled and took from a plate in the centre of the table a piece of hot, freshly buttered toast and covered it with a thick layer of sweet-smelling marmalade. He took a bite. You could immediately tell by the way his eyes scrunched up and his lips made a whistling shape that it tasted absolutely delicious. This really is very kind of you, you know. Maybe I'll be able to return your hospitality one day. The blacksmith seemed to be deep in thought for a few seconds.
Perhaps you can. How about doing some work for me in the smithy for a few days? I could do with a hand. We got a spare room you can sleep in. We got plenty of food, and if it all works out, you could come along to the upperheads next appearance. They always welcome new faces, and if you were to be chosen, I think they'd find your questions quite interesting.
Wanderer let his mind settle on the idea. Why not? When do I start?
How about this morning? I've got 4 carriage horses that need shoeing and a rush job. Renewing the teeth on some worn out arrows for the farm up the road.
The next week just flew by for the Wanderer. Working a 12-hour day, eating heartily and spending the evenings in deep conversation with the blacksmith had given him a great feeling of contentment. Rising with the sun, washing in the brook, picking vegetables from the garden, talking under the stars had brought him closer to the natural way, the moment, being and not doing. The closest he'd been for a long, long time. However, he could not help rising from his bed every morning wishing the days away so that Friday and the upperheads would arrive more quickly, and he could decide whether to ask the question that had been bothering him all week.
If scarecrows scare crows, what scares a scarecrow? No! Violet, violet, violet. Walk down the lane with your hand in mine, with your skirt half down in the sweet moonlight. Show me the ways of love tonight. You take your friends into the field and show them how to plough their way to your furrow, dear. Won't you teach me how? Violet, violet time. Walk down the lane with your hand in mine, with your skirt off down in the sweet moonlight. Show me the ways of love tonight. We play the game of hands. You let your fingers run. Run inside me jerking slide the courtship of your tongue. Violet, violet time. Walk down the lane with your hand in mine, with your skirt off down in the sweet moonlight. Show me the ways of love tonight. Behind the cider press, I'll fall upon your dress. Take it off. Thumb fingers buttonhole, your fine and ample chest. Violet, violet time. Walk down the lane with your hand in mine, with your skirt off down in the sweet moonlight. Show me the ways of teach us all the ways of kissing in the undergreen on those hot summer days. Violet, violet time, walk down the lane with your hand in line, with your skirt off down in the sweet moonlight. Show me the ways of love tonight. You made me friend stand tall. Kissing me behind the wall. Your hands are busy over time, shaking me friend into violet, violet time. Walk down the lane with your hand in mine, with your skirt off down in the sweet moonlight. Show me the ways of love tonight.
So what are you going to ask them if they choose you?
Shouted the blacksmith, who was bringing over yet another round of drinks from the bar. Conversations around the table immediately changed in focus, with everybody not really paying attention to what they'd been listening to before, but instead waiting to hear what the answer to the question from the blacksmith would be. From another part of the tavern you wouldn't have noticed anything. People were still speaking at the same volume, their eyes were still set on the faces of the folk talking to them, but there had been a change. The questioner dug a large hole in the vicinity of the table, and anything being said was sliding quickly down into the centre of it and away. The wanderer looked over with a great big grin on his face, and after a few seconds silence filled it.
Why, I'm going to ask them when my new friend will stop asking me embarrassing questions.
The old table erupted into laughter.
Serves you right,
said the parson, wiping the remnants of his last swig of beer from his mouth.
You've been asking for that for a long time.
I'll second that.
Blurted out the baker, his mouth still half full of food.
Your bloody nose is going to get you in trouble one day.
The blacksmith placed the drinks carefully in the middle of the table and sat down, his face shining with mischief.
Well, I just reckon he's got a really interesting one up his sleeve. Can't you tell by the way he's smiling now? Come on, friend, share it with us.
Go on. You can just wait until tomorrow morning. I'm going to keep you guessing all night. It's a punishment for driving me so hard all week. Just look at these hands. They were as smooth as a baby's bum last Friday. Now they look as if they've been driven over by a carriage wheel. The laughter started up again as each of the company helped themselves to their fresh drink. I've been thinking about that question from a few weeks ago. You know, the one you asked about tutting.
Exclaimed the barber suddenly. He looked over at the undertaker, who had already busily drained half his tankard of beer.
What about it?
Well, you asked why do we tut? And the small one answered because we don't tot. And you look confused.
I still am. I should imagine everybody else is.
The people at the table all nodded their heads in agreement.
Yes, that was one of their more cryptic moments.
Mumbled the verger to the parson, nervously rubbing his hands together in his lap.
I must admit, I was confused at the time, but I think I can understand what they're getting at now.
Come on, then. Let's hear your amazing words of wisdom.
Well,
started the barber, and then proceeded to wait a few minutes until he was sure he had everybody's attention. The undertaker shifted around in his chair, becoming more and more irritated.
Tell us, then. We haven't got all night.
Well, when do you tut?
When people like you start to speak.
We tut to ourselves normally, and more often than not, we tut under our breath, so to speak. Well, let me give you an example. Think back to your days at school. They might be difficult for you to remember, seeing how far off they are. Imagine you're sitting at your desk and the teacher says something that really irritates you.
Like, get your hair cut, barber.
Well, he wouldn't have said that, would he? Because I wasn't a barber then. Or can't you work that out?
The undertaker leant back in his chair, pleased with the fact he'd got under his skin. and just sat there holding his beer mug almost maternally in his lap. The barber calmed himself down and continued. As I was saying, if he said something that really irritated you, you would tend to tut to yourself under your breath, almost as a reflex to affirm to yourself that something is wrong and has displeased you.
We understand that, Barber, but why a tut?
Well, he replied, leaving yet another gap in the conversation, a habit that was now starting to annoy the rest of the people around the table, their concentration severely lacking due to the amount they'd all had to drink. There was a fair amount of shuffling and shared looks of annoyance, and a few of them had even started to have their own conversations again. The barber saw it was all or nothing. Well, they all looked up angrily. Sorry. You can't do anything but tut without moving your mouth, and then you'd be seen. There was a silence.
What are you talking about? I've heard enough of this. Who wants another drink? You're round, Parson.
The parson gave the undertaker a stare that was hardly God-given, and then nodded to the verger, who sprang up and started taking the orders. Everybody else seemed to have lost their patience with the barber's explanation as well. The wanderer moved off towards the toilet, the blacksmith started telling a joke about something to do with bellows and a randy steeplejack, and even the instigator himself seemed to have given up, settling himself in his chair again, tutting at their total lack of understanding and foresight.
Hang on, I think he's got something.
The others looked over to the corner, where they thought he'd fallen asleep, and saw the baker, blurry-eyed and red-nosed, still with a morsel of stained kidney pie hanging from the corner of his mouth into his beer-sodden facial hair. It had been there almost from the moment he'd started eating the pie about 20 minutes previously, and now it was moving as he spoke, lying there, not sure whether to fall out was more preferable to being scooped up by the baker's huge sloppy tongue and whipped inside his cavernous mouth to eventually end up alongside the rest of the flesh he was currently digesting in his ample bubble of a stomach. He started making one of the strangest noises. It was like a combination between the sound of distant tapping and thick mud being stirred with great difficulty. He accompanied this with a fountain of damp pastry flakes being sprayed from behind his lips straight into his lap, forced there by his head lurching forward in time with each of the peculiar sounds. The barber shot back to his feet.
He understands. He's got it. He's tutting. Or is it tatting? No, it's definitely tutting. Look, it's impossible to do without moving your mouth. Baker, show us a tat.
The baker immediately changed tack. His cheeks opened out to the side, and his mouth widened into a dripping mobile canyon of saliva. It dribbled from the two corners into his beard in the gaps between the tats, and then seemed to emerge almost like a sheep when he actually made the sound, landing at his feet in small paws. The noise that he was making was even stranger than the original one. If you shut your eyes, you could imagine a lone potholer trying to hammer a crampon into a rock face while suspended by a rope above what sounded like a bottomless gorge. The peculiarity that was inherent to the noise was that it sounded as if, whilst trying to do this, the potholer was spinning at a huge velocity, creating a background resonance that filtered through from behind the main hammering to create an almost two-dimensional soundscape.
That's it! Tutting is the only one you can do without moving your mouth. Not totting or tatting or titting or tetting, only tutting. Now you imagine what would have happened to you if that had been your response to what your teacher had said that irritated you.
He pointed over to the baker, who by now was bright red in the face from making what sounded like a tut, a tot, a tet, a tit, and a tat, all rolled into one. Now, whenever anything happens that can be physically tried out, like touching your nose with your tongue, or wiggling your ears, or making farting noises with your armpits, you know it'll spread like wildfire, especially in a tavern where literally everyone's drunk. And this is exactly what happened on this occasion. But it didn't really spread like wildfire, more like when a dog starts barking late at night. The canine message is passed on to the next nearest, and so on until within a few minutes every dog within 10 miles would be baying as if there was no tomorrow. The verger told the landlord as he was ordering the drinks. The landlord passed it on to the chimney sweep and his mates at the end of the bar. One of this company parsed it onto the road layer and his gang were playing skittles. Before you knew it, the tavern was home to some of the strangest man-made noises you'd ever likely to hear.
Silver the secret, golden the game, turning the oceans on top of the sky, lost in the found of night and day, finding the way in the blink of an eye. Silver the secret, golden the game, turning the oceans on top of the sky, lost in the found of night and day, finding the way in the blink of an Silver the secret, golden the game, turning the oceans on top of the sky, lost in the found of night and day, finding the way in the blink of an eye. Silver the secret, golden the game, turning the oceans on top of the sky, lost in the found of night and day, finding the way in the blink of an eye. And the music, melodies that cannot be imagined, sounds that are seen. The tune danced around the wanderer's head like unfettered dreams, rising and falling gently as if carried by a magical wind through his imagination. The voices harmonized, each individual being heard, yet also the whole spreading itself, a velvet sea, over and under, washing the rhythm of the words into a swaying incantation. Silver the secret, golden the game, turning the oceans on top of the sky, lost in the found of night and the day, finding the way in the blink of an eye. Silver the secret, golden the game, turning the oceans on top of the sky, lost in the found of night and the day, finding the way in the blink of an
The blacksmith shook the wanderer by the elbow.
Time to get up. They'll be coming out in 3/4 of an hour.
Within minutes, the two men were dressed and making their way hurriedly up the hill, eager to find a position near the front. As they approached the crest, they saw the gathering had already organised itself into a circle, all around the manhole, and it was 2 or 3 people thick even at this early hour. The blacksmith tutted.
Oh, for goodness sake, don't do that. Not after last night. We'll both start up again. I don't think I can laugh anymore.
Do you remember that road layer saying he could make a tip without moving his mouth? And the chimney sweep swearing that the tot and a tat the same thing?
What about the baker ordering the next pie and getting another bit stuck in his beard in exactly the same place on the other side of his mouth? And then proceeded to blow them both off at once with one of the biggest sets of the evening.
Did you see where they landed?
No, where?
In the rim of the parson's hat. I bet they're still there. It really was a great night. Even the barber and the undertaker were getting on at the end. Did you see him dancing and singing around the table together? That must have been a first.
Yes, I did, said the Wanderer, stopping suddenly at a gap in the circle. He looked around.
Sorry to interrupt, but what about here? You can see the manhole, and we're only 2 people in from the front.
Great, we'll stop here. It doesn't really matter anyway. You can see wherever you're standing as long as you're here at the beginning. It's just that I feel I've got more chance of being chosen if I'm near the front. Just superstition, I suppose.
What do you mean, you can see wherever you're standing? When I was here last week, I couldn't see a thing.
If you'd been here at the beginning, you would have done.
The blacksmith saw the Wanderer look confused.
Look, it'll all be as clear as anything soon. Just be patient.
The 2 friends stood silently, hands in pockets, staring into the middle of the circle. Around them, the gathering was rapidly increasing in number. It was now at least 7 people thick and was still growing. The folk were arriving late, were just taking up a position, anywhere on the circumference, not appearing to be at all interested, as the blacksmith had said, in having a view into the centre. Nobody tried to push their way forward, or search for a gap, or even stand on their toes. Everybody just seemed content to be where they were, seemingly waiting patiently for it all to begin. However, the Wanderer did feel an undercurrent running through the crowd. Although the conversation was jovial and everyone appeared to be in good humour, he felt a collective competitive urge rising from the circle, almost visible like a heat haze. The urge to be chosen, the urge to have their question answered. From outside it was probably hardly noticeable, but inside it was most definitely there, and was growing more powerful every second. The conversations appeared to become more and more matter of fact as the strength of the urge grew, almost as if the reduction in the one aided the expansion of the other and vice versa. The Wanderer found himself moving with this, and he let his question, that had been itching in the background all week, go floating up to join the others. Like hundreds of barrage balloons captive at the end of lines held in their parents' hands, the questions floated en masse above the crowd, creating a hermetic roof over the early morning pleasantries going on below.
It's time again.
Sent Big Up Her Head.
Oh, I hope they're a bit more interesting today than they were last week. Any more questions about crop rotation or when's the right time to put out your tomatoes? And I think I'm going to scream!
Sent back Small Upper Head. Big Upper Head felt a pang of deep affection for his partner rise in his heart as he sent a laugh spinning across to her.
Come on then, let's go!
He put his foot on the first rung of the ladder and started to climb up towards the manhole cover. Small Upper Head followed close behind. When he reached the top, he mumbled something to himself and then slowly pushed open the cover, letting a rectangular slab of sunlight slide onto the tunnel wall opposite. He looked back down and couldn't help but smile at his love's frowning face, appearing framed by it. She sent a nag.
Hurry up and don't trip over this time!
Small Upper Head glanced at him, thinking how handsome he looked, his profile bold against the clear slash of sky that was now showing between the open cover and the top of the tunnel. She felt a cauldron of warmth glow from her stomach as she carried on climbing, and as she took hold of his strong hands as he helped up the last few rungs and threw it onto the surface, she realised how absolutely and completely happy she was. The Wanderer had been one of the first in the circle to see the manhole cover move, and then lightness. Everything seemed to soften and roll onto a breathing ball of space, inhaling and exhaling the future, past and present, into one way and the other at the same time. No fear, no body, no me, no you. Up is down and round is flat, through his back and front is not. And the music. Melodies that cannot be imagined, sounds that are seen. The tune danced around the Wanderer's head like unfettered dreams, rising and falling gently as if carried by a magical wind through his imagination. The voices harmonised, each individual being heard, yet also the whole spreading itself, a velvet sea, over and under, washing the rhythm of the words into a swaying incantation. Silver the secret and golden the game, turning the oceans on top of the sky, lost in the found of night under day, finding the way in the blink of an eye. The wanderer felt his whole focus drawn towards the manhole cover. It was not forced but direct. He was still aware of who he was and where he was, but that didn't seem to matter. All it did was the scene that was unfolding in the middle of the circle. The music continued to weave amongst the words of the quatrain, in and around and out and back again, delicately entwining the wanderer's attention in between the two figures that were now climbing out and hole in the ground that the open manhole cover had left. The big one had appeared first and had bent down to help the smaller one out into the open. They were now standing arm in arm, smiling their way around the circle. They were both dressed in bottle green tunics and red gloves. The smaller one wore a pair of purple breeches with gold rings hanging from the belt, whilst the larger one wore a black and white checked skirt dotted with variously coloured pictures of trees. Their shoes could have individually easily been mistaken for the hull of the child's colourful tie boat, but for the fact that each of them had thumb-sized holes drilled all the way round the edge laced with what looked like huge plaited strands of fresh seaweed. Their faces were most enticing. They both had a look of mischief in their eyes, but it was tempered by a shining happiness that infectiously sang its way across to whoever they were sending to. Their eyes were round and infant innocent, yet at the same time as old as the sky and as wise as wise. On their lips they wore a striking orange lipstick that looked as if it had been put on in the dark with a wet flannel. To complete the peculiar picture, their heads were about half as big again as normal. Widthwise they looked about average, but the gap between their eyebrows and the top of their heads gave the impression that a force had been exerted on each ear simultaneously, and that their skull had compensated for this by simply moving upwards and inwards to create what was an almost perfect ellipse. The overall effect was further accentuated by the fact that neither of them had a single hair on their head.
Good morning!
The wanderer heard it, but could not at first fathom where it had come from. This time the words were communal, and he felt himself, along with the others, say it in reply, although he knew he had not uttered a sound.
Maybe we could have our table and chairs, and then we can start.
The opposite side of the circle parted, and two flustered-looking men hurried through with a small wooden table, followed by 3 young children, each dragging a chair behind them. They set them up just in front of the manhole cover, which had now been lowered back in its shut position, and looked apologetically at the upperheads.
I'm really sorry we're late. We couldn't find the key for the barn, and one of the cats is pregnant, and we thought she was going into labour, and what with having to get breakfast for the kids, we just
Can't seem to shake off that hangover from last night. Thank you for this anyway.
Sent Small Upperhead, shaking them all by the hand.
It was most kind of you to help again.
The 2 men smiled sheepishly, and nodding at the upperheads, walked away, followed by the 3 children into the crowd. Everything was being parsed in a different way. Not conversations as the wanderer had come to know them. Nobody had spoken, but everything had been heard. Some things were hidden, but everything could be seen. The sifting strains of the music still completely filled him, took it all to him, but at the same time he could hear the slightest sound in the centre of the circle, even down to the flapping of the seaweed as the upperheads went to their table. The circle parted to the right of the wanderer, and a boy of about 4 walked out and sat down. The upperheads now lay on their backs under the table with the tip of their heads touching, their arms by their sides, their eyes closed, and their legs propped up, crossed at the ankle, each on the edge of a chair.
My mummy and daddy tell me I must eat what is put in front of me or I won't grow big and strong, but a lot of it, like mashed potato and cauliflower cheese and rice pudding with jam in it and the white bit of eggs and every salad I've ever had, tastes so horrible I can't. What should I do?
The answer was almost immediate.
Hold your nose closed while you're eating, and you won't taste a thing. And just breathe through your mouth slowly as you chew the food. I know your mummy and daddy tell you to hold your knife and fork properly, but we're sure on these occasions they all mind If you pinch your nostrils together with one hand and use a fork or spoon to lift the food to your mouth with the other one, all the goodness from the food will go inside your tummy, but you won't taste any of the nasty things you don't like.
This reply was sent in unison and had a joyful harmonic quality, with Big Upperhead's soprano lying comfortably over Small Upperhead's baritone. The little boy looked absolutely delighted with the answer. A beaming smile stretched right across his lively little face. He turned and walked towards his two parents, who were standing at the front of the circle, roughly where it opened to let the little one through a few minutes ago.
Go on, don't be shy,
they said, waving their hands towards the still stationary and horizontal upperheads. The little boy looked back at the two bizarre figures, and then back again at his smiling parents, who were still motioning him into the direction of the peculiar scene in the middle of the circle.
Go on, son, they've helped you. Just go and say thank you.
He slowly wandered over to the table, got down on his hands and knees, and looked at the two upperheads laying there perfectly still.
Thank you,
he mumbled, stood up quickly and ran back to where his parents were.
Come on, let's have another go. They're not going to hurt you. You've seen it happen before, remember?
The boy smiled as his father lifted him up and carried him back over to the table. He crouched down on his haunches and put the toddler onto the grass so he could see the upperheads again.
4 trees and then pull a gold ring,
he whispered into his son's ear. The little boy giggled to himself, and filled with the courage that small children only find when their parents are by their sides, crawled under the table and very quickly, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before, pressed 4 of the coloured trees on Big Upperhead's skirt and gave one of the gold rings on Small Upperhead's belt a good yank. There was a delay of a few seconds, and then the two of them kicked their chairs away, rolled from under the table, and without using their arms flicked themselves up into a standing position. They both bowed to the small child and then took off, sprinting around the inside of the circle. The incantation that had been almost subliminally there now came to the fore again as the two of them gathered speed, keeping exactly half a circle's distance between themselves. They were now moving at such a pace on the ground it was difficult for the crowd to distinguish any detail, but as they somersaulted each time the chant reached the words eye and sky, you could see them more clearly again. They twisted high up into the air in unison, wiggling their backsides a little boy, causing him to send a flock of chuckles floating up towards them. As they started their descent, the two upperheads plucked the chuckles from the open sky and sent them spinning back into the crowds, spraying the gathering like a soft rain. The people on the ground then started to send laughs, until the whole soundscape was drenched in a frenzy of rolling, mellifluous mountains of notes, which rose to tease the tummets and fell to fill the canyons deep with their resonating touch of happiness. Gradually, the two figures slowed down until they once again came to a halt in front of the child. They bowed slowly to him, their foreheads just touching the ground, and then sauntered back over to the table, picking up the chairs on the way and took up their positions on the ground, ready for the next question. The little boy, sending out chatters of excitement in front of him, was led away back into the crowd by his parents just as the other side of the circle opened up and a new questioner stepped out.
Why can't animals speak? How do I stop snails getting in my sorrow? Why are carrots orange? Why does sky and sea begin with S?
Do mountains go down as much as they go up?
Why do cows moo? Is it true that everybody from London knows everything? When does a carpet become a wood, and when does a wood become a forest, and what is a spinney? When I whisk the batter in my Yorkshire pudding, is it best to whisk it clockwise or anti-clockwise? If scarecrows scare crows, what? No!
The answers were always immediate, whether straight or cryptic, and as soon as there was a thank you, the unusual circumambulation started. The upperheads never tired, despite the sprinting, the somersaults, and the relentless questioning, and every answer was given in the same exuberant way. The lightness that had feathered the air since the beginning settled upon the gathering like a fine silk sheet, and immediately sent a static charge of yes through everyone who was there. It seemed a chain altogether, linking with a soft strength, pliable in its power, delicate to its very centre, which lay caressing the whole scene. The sense was parsed as an eternal pulse, sparkling to and fro across the universal synapse, out of time, out of place, secret in its openness and complete love. The circle opened, and out stepped the parson. He strolled purposely over to the table and sat down. He kissed the crucifix that hung round his neck, and then sent the question.
How can I help more people to find God?
The answer was as usual, instantaneous, but this time in the form of a list.
Number 1. God needs us as much as we need it. It's incomplete and had to create man to try to make itself whole. Number 2. To find God, one has to look inside and not bother with external images that are just projections of the real deity within. Number 3. The concept of the Trinity can only be made true by integrating the devil to make the four.
As the upperheads had started sending their answer from under the table, the music had faded away and an oppressive silence crept over the top of the hill, beginning to suffocate with its thick, stagnant entropy the lightness that had previously been dancing so easily amongst the gathering. A yes had become a no, and the no had brought with it doubt. People were looking worriedly around, shuffling nervously, exchanging anxious glances, and appearing confused. This had not been seen before on an upperheads day. The tone of the answer was far from exuberant. The harmony of the previous responsive had disappeared and been replaced with a flat, monotonous drawl, which seeped from the two suspicious-looking characters lying under the table. Then point number 4 hit home.
Number 4, if you preach any of these ideas, parson, you're going to be out of a job.
Within a flash, the few moments of darkness were easily stripped away like a decaying bark from a trunk of a tree and thrown spinning off into the distance as the incantation, the music, the connections, the rhythm, the intoxication and the flow all returned spiraling in, lifting the crowd away with it all back into the warm vibration of normal upperhead time. The euphoria that was sent was immense. The sense of relief catapulted huge chunks of laughter from the crowd into the centre, causing the two upperheads to twitch with delight, both straining, waiting for a thank you, ready to speed off around the inside of the circle to celebrate yet another answer. But a thank you from the parson seemed an age away. As the reply had reached the beginning of its second point, he had stood up, swirling his black cape around and stamped off back into the crowd, his crucifix thumping angrily against his chest and his face as dark and as menacing as the centre of a deep, murky, still pond. However, by the time he pushed his way through to the other side, muttering curses under his breath, the upperheads had decided to start themselves what would turn out to be their final celebration of the day.
Thank us!
They shrieked sent as they leapt from underneath the table, obviously unable to contain themselves any longer. They pawed a ring, pressed 4 trees, and the sprinting and the somersaults that followed were the fastest and the highest that had been seen all morning. The leaps were so high, in fact, the small upperhead, at the start of one of the descents, could just make out over the top of the crowd the hurrying figure of the parson at the bottom of the hill being trailed by the verger, who was desperately trying to catch him up, waving his umbrella at him. This picture made small upperhead send out a huge roar of laughter, which seemed incredibly to give the two of them even more energy as they continued hurtling round the circle, sending the gathering into raptures. Eventually, however, everything started to slow down, and it was obvious that the morning on the hill was coming to a close. The upperheads returned to the centre of the circle next to the manhole cover and stood back to back looking into the crowd. They rotated themselves slowly clockwise, 360 degrees, bowing and waving until they finished up back where they'd started. The two of them quickly, before anybody really had a chance to send anything, lifted up the cover and disappeared back down into the tunnel. The lightness lifted. The wanderer was absolutely astonished. He'd never witnessed anything like that, and he didn't think he ever would again. Although there had been one thing. As the upperheads had been rotating at the end, small upperhead had looked straight at him and sent what appeared to be a personal message.
Interesting question. Come again next week and you'll be the first one.
The wanderer had taken this to mean that he would definitely be chosen the following Friday. This was an opportunity he could ill afford to miss, and he set himself thinking how he could go about staying another week. Well, he needn't have worried, because as they made their way back town to the cottage, the blacksmith solved the problem for him.
Shame they didn't choose you. I was sure they would. Fancy staying this coming week and giving me another hand? I could do with it.
The wanderer took this as fate at work and immediately accepted. The next 7 days just shot by, and before he really had time to think about it, it was Thursday night again, and another magical time on the hill was close at hand. The wanderer lay in bed contemplating how he could phrase his question in the morning. He'd spent the evening in the smithy garden having a farewell dinner with the blacksmith and his wife, and now was letting the taste of the spit-roasted suckling pig, the fresh vegetables and the wine mingle with his tiredness as he waited for the first touches of sleep to take him away. He could just make out the brow of the hill in the distance, outlined against the full moon, and was dreamily imagining the scene in the morning. Their first appearance. Would they be dressed the same? How would he feel as he walked out into the middle of the circle? Would the lightness and joy be as intense again? It couldn't possibly be. What would their answer be? He turned over onto his side and let himself slide away, the occasional pop of the dying fire in the garden bringing him momentarily back, and then once again drifting away, content, nestled in the soft warm folds of the feather-filled quilt he lay curled up under. At first, he thought it was part of the sound of the brook chattering away to itself as it made its way across the valley. But as he lay straining his ears, he started to make out the low whisper of human voices. Initially, they appeared to be coming from inside the room itself, but as his ears became used to the new sound, he realised they were coming from outside the open window. And he started to be able to make out what they were saying.
Have you got all the stuff?
I think so.
Don't think. Have you got it or not?
Yes. The whispers were barely audible, and although the wanderer couldn't place the voices at all, there was a familiarity about them. He carefully slipped out from underneath the cover and padded slowly over to the window. Something about the whispering had made him think he should keep himself quiet and hidden until he found out exactly what was happening out there.
Good. We'll show these arrogant bastards who's who around here.
The voice had moved up the register and the wanderer placed it immediately. He peeped out from behind the curtain, and sure enough, standing there in the lane under the overhanging canopy of the willow was the large rotund frame of the parson. Opposite him stood the stooped figure of the verger, who was rapidly nodding his head at the parson's every word. To the side of him stood two other figures the wanderer didn't recognise, who were each carrying a lumpy bundle over their shoulder.
Right. Come on, let's do it.
The parson pointed in the direction of the hilltop, and the four men set off quickly, one behind the other, up the slope. The wanderer was disturbed. What would the parson and the verger be doing here at this time of night, and why the unholy language? He'd heard a few profanities fall from the parson's lips on his visit to the local inn, but that had all been in good humour. There was no humour at all in the clipped tones he'd been using then. He tried to place the two strangers with the sags. What were they carrying? He started to think that maybe it was none of his business. He'd only been in the air for 2 weeks, and perhaps late night activity like this was nothing out of the ordinary. But he kept coming back to that arrogant bastards and couldn't get it out of his head. Something was definitely wrong. He looked back out the window and saw he must have been preoccupied with these thoughts for longer than it had felt. The tail of the four men had reached the brow of the hill and were just disappearing out of view. Instinctually, the wanderer knew he had to follow him. He quickly pulled on his clothes and as quickly as he could tiptoed down the stairs and let himself out the front door. The hill loomed large and harsh as he stood looking up at the brow. Its outline seemed different from when you looked at it in the daylight. The smooth edges had been replaced by an ominous jaggedness which violently cut into the spectral sky, tearing and penetrating, fertilising heavens with its hanging darkness. As the wanderer started the steep climb, he continually felt its presence as a tightness around his throat, pulling him upwards, pulling him towards something that he knew he didn't want to find. His steps were no longer completely his own. The earth seemed to be lifting him to its top as an invited witness of what was unfolding up there. He felt his breathing quicken as he was sucked upwards, and only by a supreme effort was he able to break away and stop. He looked ahead of himself. He was by now over halfway there. Something had changed. Initially he thought it was the first push of the morning sun climbing up over the hill, but the dim reddish-yellow glow that was playing a halo above the very top was far different to a sunrise. It pulsed in its intensity, fading to literally nothing and then rising again. Curiously, the increase in the colour's depth seemed to coincide with each breath of the wind that was now spirling around the hill. The brow lured him onwards. He felt the tightness and heaviness return again as he gradually began to realise what it was that was causing such a strange effect. A fire. Smoke and the spit and crackle of flames flavoured the air as he struggled the last few feet to the top. It was not the density of smoke you'd expect from a forest fire, but more like the wisps you would see from a controlled blaze, drifting in patches of grey in front of the moving night sky. The wanderer climbed out to the top of the hill and looked at the scene in front of him.
What have you done?
The wanderer spun round.
The hill loomed large, penetrating the heavens, fertilizing the hanging darkness. The climb was so steep, he felt the tightness around his throat, violently cut into the spectral sky. Upon the hill there's something on, upon the hill. Upon the hill there's something on, something on.
scattered pieces of burning clothing. 2 naked bodies at the upper edge lay cruciform, wooden stakes through their throats, genitals, wrists and ankles, and both their skulls smashed and pulled open.